Welcome to One Moment After the End, a podcast in support of the webcomic of the same name. This is a special re-recording to improve the quality of some of my first podcasts. As this is a re-recording, I've compressed several of the original podcasts down in size. The next podcast in sequence should be Podcast 7, so new listeners who do not want to suffer through my early podcasts should skip to that one after this. Of course, the early podcasts might have some entertainment value for just the sheer agony of how bad they are. Because this is a re-recording and meant to make the archives a bit easier to listen to, I've decided not to do as much post-production work on these first shows. Some of the voices of various characters may therefore sound a little different than they appear in the later recordings. I'll be recording this as one long single recording, but we'll break it up into 4 episodes, which will replace the original 1 through 4 episodes in the archives. That means episodes 5 and 6 will be the original recordings and be out of sequence. First, some business. The URL for One Moment After the End is at cosmofur.hop2.org, and you can reach us at onemomentafter@gmail.com. It is my intent to keep this podcast reasonably family-friendly and perhaps work-safe, but the webcomic version is not. You should not browse the images on the website where children or your boss might see. Without giving away any spoilers, the nature of some of the main characters result in situations where they are wearing minimal to no clothing. And while in a podcast audio, the clothing state of characters is ignored or easily overlooked, in the visual media of a webcomic, it is much greater immediate impact. Welcome to One Moment After the End. Perhaps it might have been interesting to be a fly on the wall in the small office, but then again it would have been a lonely life, as no flies, ants, gnats, or any other small crawly thing had ever been in that room before, or was likely to be there in the future. Nevertheless, a fly-eye view would have let you ogle the rather cute-looking, if tired, bunny that was standing by her desk, which other than a few bookshelves was the only important piece of furniture in the room. Now, when I say bunny, I'm not talking about a cute, lupine creature with fur and a tendency to nibble away at backyard gardens, nor the semi-sexist reference of bikini-clad girls in 1960s beach movies. No, standing at 5'4" was a human, or at least humanoid woman, wearing a tight-fitting, but in her mind, conservative jumpsuit. What made her a bunny was her 2-feet-long ears and jutting muzzle, and a nearly invisibly fine, short velvet-like fur that covered her body from head to toe. If you asked what she was, the woman would have given you a very strange look, and said she was human, and would have been insulted if you pressed the question any further. Not that you could have asked her anything, as an impossible fly, and a good thing too, as she was not in a good mood today. Her boss had thrown her another last-minute job, and her temper was now very short. This short temper was not made happier when her assistant slipped in the room with a clear, "got another problem to dump on you" look on his face. The assistant was not another rabbit. His ears were shorter, more pointed, and his muzzle was sloped down further from his forehead. Differently, he was a cat. Spotting the Catman, the first woman snapped a question at him before he could say whatever was on his mind. Perhaps it was an attempt to delay the bad news. Well, whatever it was. "Eric, where is the bio on the Hecklebomb kids?" The assistant, Eric, replied in as soothing a tone as he could manage. "Here's a report on her husband, Jarek. The rest should pop up on your desk scroll 3. Then Eric did not pause for Ellen to reply, but continued on his real reason he was moving through the room at a near run. "I just got a memo from building maintenance. They overscheduled the waiting rooms. We need to find someplace else for the meeting." The female rabbit, whose name I should mention is Ellen, sat down at her desk, her eyes rolling in exasperation. "What? Jolan is arriving any second." Eric spun on his heels, his message delivered. He now ran back out the door as fast as he had came in. "I'm on it," he called back over his shoulder at Ellen, and he was gone. Ellen sat at her desk, took a calming breath. Other than some bland paper documents, the only thing on her desk was some sort of computer display. There was no keyboard or other input device. Ellen did not need such things. She glanced at the screen, and by some hidden means it knew what information she wanted to see. Graphs flowed, long paragraphs of text scrolled, and pictures showed on the profiles of strangers flicking by. It seemed impossible that Ellen could have really absorbed data moving that fast, but she seemed satisfied with whatever she was seeing. Looking down, Ellen thought to herself, "Another rush job. 20 years? Tomorrow. Oh, I've been a greeter for 20 years. Counting my time here, I'm now what? 67? Damn it. I think I worked through my birthday again. Not even a card. If you were that fly on the wall still, it would not be strange if you chose this moment to fall off in surprise, because no sane person looking at Ellen would guess her to be many years past 20. Yet, perhaps, if you looked in her dark eyes, you might just see a hint of the years they had seen. Ellen looked at the display again. Eric wasn't back. She could pause and wait for him. That would have been the right thing to do. But this was the last session for the day, and she wanted to get it over with. A counter dominated the display now and started to count down. Ellen let it drop to 0, and glanced at the empty chair across from her. It wasn't empty any more. A foggy shape formed in the air. It was a skeleton of a muzzled female figure, covered with a hazy cloud which thickened. Soon the nude body of a bare-faced woman could be seen through the haze. The newly formed bear woman did not move, and Ellen waited. There was more unseen changes taking place in the mists, which soon thickened and grew more solid, draping over the woman's form as a gray-white robe. Ellen sat watching the process with detached familiarity. Suddenly the new woman stood up, knocking her chair backwards, and gasped. A long, snorkish gasp, like a baby filling its lungs for the first time. At that same moment, Ellen said simply, "Welcome back." The woman looked around, startled. She stammered, What? How did the doctor, he was going to... To herself, Ellen thought, "It's always hard to get started." Out loud, Ellen reached out to the newly arrived woman. "Jolan, my name is Ellen. I have to ask for your trust. You no longer have to worry about the doctor. He can't hurt you again. Nothing can." The woman, Jolan, seemed even more confused by this, and with greater volume she said, "What do you mean? Where am I? Am I going back to the camp? I can work." Ellen sighed. Sometimes it was easier than others. Sometimes they figured it out for themselves by now. Other times they had to be led. "Jolan, that is behind you. No one will force you to work again. Not that way. Your time on earth is over. There'll be no more pain." Jolan moved her jaws a few times before she found her voice. The strange way Ellen had said that drew Jolan's attention, and she realized the possible explanation, even as she tried to reject it. You can't mean it. I can't be dead." Ellen didn't answer at first. She instead thought to herself, "Poor dear, I can only imagine what she's dealing with. Unlike her, I never really had to worry about that. It wasn't even a matter of faith for me, was it? I always knew about this place." For a long moment, Jolan did not react. It was as if she had lost her voice and her ability to move. Her eyes were locked onto Ellen's chair, but did not move when Ellen stood up and walked around the table. "Oh, my dear," Ellen said, recognizing a familiar reaction. As she walked around to Jolene's side, Ellen thought to herself, "So many times I've seen this. Being immortal doesn't mean anything to her. Not yet. She's lost so much. Her home, her plans, her future." Taking a deep breath to strengthen herself, Ellen thought, "I have to be strong for her when she starts to cry." Ellen was professional. She had been doing this job for years and years. She opened her mouth to say the well-practiced platitudes to calm and comfort the woman. She looked down at Jolene and prepared herself to do her job. But Ellen's eyes couldn't focus. That was odd. Why couldn't she see properly? Ellen blinked, felt tears blur her vision more. She gasped. Her mind wanted to say words of comfort, but they felt so hollow. She couldn't say them. Instead, a long, painful wail, unexpected, unwanted, and very unprofessional, spilled from Ellen's lips, like poison vomited. Perhaps had Ellen been able to find her voice, and had said the simple, empty words of comfort she had meant to say, Jolene would have been the one to break down in tears, and their expected roles of bereaved and comforter would have been played out in the usual script. Instead, Ellen's wail shocked Jolene out of her own self-pitying reverie, and she turned in shock and surprise towards Ellen, thinking, "If I'm dead, what is she? Is that an angel? Is an angel crying for me?" Around the same time, Eric, not knowing that Ellen had already started the greeting, was standing in a long office corridor, talking through a service window, behind which sat a bored-looking clerk. The clerk had a frankly Bovian appearance. It would have been no insult, just a factual statement, to call her a cow. Eric did not care what she looked like. He was too angry to notice or care. "How can you assign a room this late?" Eric nearly screamed this at her. The clerk cared even less than Eric. She wanted to get back to her own work, and just wished the annoying Catman would just go away. "The legal needed it for some press event," she told him. Eric just rolled his eyes at the mention of legal, and taking his tone down a notch or two, he replied with a sort of sing-song voice that one uses to explain the obvious to annoying people who already know the right thing to do, but is refusing to do it out of spite. "I have 2 new residents who have to make a decision that will affect their lives for years, and you expect them to make it standing in the hall?" The clerk said, "Whatever. Just keep your pants on." And in an undertone that Eric could just make out, she whispered to herself, "Not that I'd mind seeing what's under them." This was no compliment from Eric's point of view, and just annoyed him more. Perhaps sensing she had crossed the line, the clerk quickly pulled out a small notepad of paper and wrote on it with a blunt-looking pen, "I have something for you, an old break room. The workers used it when they added that wing to the rehabilitation center. It's a bit out of the way, but it's the best I can do. Take this map. You'll need it." The clerk handed Eric the paper. On it was an animated map showing a twisted path through many hallways to a blank square that must have been the break room. After leaving the clerk behind, Eric followed the map deep into the twisted maze of hallways, moving from clean and open halls to far dirtier and dimmer places, ending in a narrow corridor, half closed, with abandoned trash and a tipped-over office furniture. Eric did not like the thought of leading a new arrival through these spaces. He whispered to himself, "This area has not been used for a while. Well, here it is. Hope it's usable." He stepped through the last doorway, and a little bit to his own surprise, found himself outside in a pleasant garden space. Behind him was a wicker garden trellis, standing on its own with plants growing around and behind it. Yet, impossibly, the utility corridor that Eric had just stepped out of was still visible through the trellis. Ella was looking side to side. Not bad. A garden and a lake. Some break room. Have to remember this place. Then Eric looked down, nearby, to an old-style wooden park bench, and scattered on the ground below it was the remains of some workman's lunch or snack, featuring a box of half-eaten donuts. Oh, yuck! How old are those donuts? There was no mold, fungus, or any decay visible in the donuts. How could there be? But Eric could not help but dwell on the thought that the rehabilitation center had been built about 10 years previously, and these donuts have been sitting there ever since. Looking side to side, Eric saw more signs of dirt and neglect. Bah, I don't have time to clean this place up. Then Eric smiled to himself. Unless I cheat a little. No residents around, so it should be okay. It is an emergency, right? Better do this quick. Then Eric did next could not be described in a world where normal physics ruled. Indeed, hadn't you been there to watch, even as a fly, the mere act of watching would have prevented Eric from doing it. What exactly did he do? Well, from Eric's point of view, he issued a mental command and a password that could not be spelt or vocalized. Then, in response, he changed shape. For the most part, Eric was still clearly himself. His face didn't change, but his body did. Previously, Eric had been wearing a uniform that was the same color as Ellen's jumpsuit, if cut less conservatively. Clearly, Eric liked to show off his body, but now he was showing it all off. The clothes were gone. Eric had traded them in for a pair of white, feathered wings and a silver sword. Eric had a smile on his face. There was a thrill of power in the shape, and a flood of new abilities that filled him up from inside. He spun himself in the air to float over the small park. His wings beat in the air, a regular pattern that mimicked the movements of bird wings, but there was no rush of air. Aerodynamics had nothing to do with Eric's flight. He was able to float suspended as long as he kept his wings moving, but it was his willpower, not the beat of the wings, which gave him direction and speed. Eric glided down to just over the worst of the trash, and he slashed it with his sword. The paper and trash broke apart. Eric slashed again, and small shreds spun into the air, fading to nothingness as they did so. Eric held his sword and issued some mental commands. Nothing visual happened at first, but Eric's eyes refocused onto empty space and moved side to side as if reading from menus and text that only he could see. After a few moments he found what he was looking for, and pointing his sword, a tea set appeared on the park bench. The scent of heavy hot tea and fresh-baked cakes filled the park. Eric landed, his arms held ready, and glanced from side to side. I don't have time for anything fancier. Hope this is enough. Just as Eric was getting ready to drop his wings and leave, he was startled by an unexpected voice coming from the hallway, still visible through the garden trellis. Eric, what are you doing? There, holding a box full of flyers and forms, stood an old friend of Eric's. The newcomer, who had floppy ears and a canine muzzle, was wearing a military-style uniform and was looking surprised, finding Eric in his wings-out form. Eric waved hello to his friend and displayed no embarrassment at being caught wearing nothing but feathers. It's okay, Lance. There's no chance any residents will see me. What are you doing here? Lance stepped into the garden and shuffled his shoulders to indicate the heavy box he was carrying. Mabel, from building, told me you were here. I was wondering if I could stow some junk in. While Lance was talking, Eric gave the mental command to cause his wings to fade away, and his normal uniform to reform around himself. He called this process dropping his wings, and neither Lance nor he thought there was anything odd about the whole process. As Eric's eyes settled on the box of papers, he wrinkled his brow and started to get angry, realizing why Lance was searching for him. "Forget it! No way! You guys in the League already took my first meeting room," Eric said with gusto. Lance seemed to take Eric's outburst in stride, and for the most part ignored it. He started walking around the garden trellis, walking towards a patch of trees. Lance reassured Eric. "No big deal. I can hide it here behind these trees." Eric was outraged and tried to stop Lance, calling out to the legal department bulldog. "Wait, the field is mostly forget it." Ignoring Eric's warning, Lance had tried to walk behind the bordered path of the garden, and had gone face first into an invisible wall. With a loud thump, he lost his balance and fell backwards. The contents of his box were dumped all over the park. Papers and forms drifted through the air like some bureaucratic's winter dream. Lying momentarily stunned, Lance looked up at Eric, standing over him, and mused, "You could have warned me sooner." Eric suppressed a smile. He was annoyed and wanted to be angry at Lance, and knew if he let himself laugh it would wreck the grudge he was nursing. "What did you expect? This is just an old break room. Even a designer wouldn't have been able to sneak in an entire mini-universe in here. The park is just a cheap illusion. What's going on illegal that got you so frazzled?" Lance took his time getting up on his knees as he answered. "The vultures are circling. The press got wind that a high-profile case is going south." Eric knew Lance well enough to realize the dog was just dying for Eric to ask a follow-up question. Then Lance would wax on for an hour about all the problems in legal, and all the frustrations he always had about his desk job there. Eric didn't have time to waste on that now. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "I don't think I want to hear any more. Just clean up. I need to get back to the heckle bombs." Lance looked around at the mess and started grumbling as he picked up the first messy handful of papers. "Fine. I'll find some other place to stow this junk." Eric was already out of the garden, and Lance followed a few moments later. Neither noticed that behind the teapot that Eric had summoned, a box of papers labeled jury forms had landed right side up, as if neatly placed there. Around the same time as this was going on, Ellen was still crying her heart out, unable to explain why, not to herself, and certainly not to Jolanne. Jolanne, having just awoken from an endless nightmare into total confusion, found herself trying to confront a strange woman in a situation that left her at a complete loss to explain what was happening. Ellen knew this was not right. She tried to shake off her own emotions and regain some composure. She thought to herself, "Stop it!" Jolanne, meanwhile, said what she felt. "I don't understand, dear, but I'm sure it'll be all right." Ellen forced herself to stand up again and shuffled back to her own chair. "No, this is all wrong. I should be comforting you. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Heckelbaum." The teddy-bear-faced woman shook her head. "Jolanne, please." Ellen smiled and regained more of her composure. "Thank you, Jolanne. I need to explain so much, and I've wasted so much of our time already." Ellen coughed to organize her thoughts, then started over. "Oh, well, let me start. I'm sure, Jolanne, that sometime during your life you wondered about if there was an afterlife. Well, being here, it's now obvious that there is. But it's probably different than whatever you might have been expecting. Some of what you may have been taught about the afterlife might have been inspired, but even the best guesses got the details wrong, or at least distorted." She paused for a moment to let that sink in. Jolanne didn't look upset with this news. Ellen sighed with some relief. Many people took the news that whatever religious teaching they had grown up with was not absolutely and divinely perfect, went badly. She continued, "For example, there is no hell." Jolanne replied, "No hell? Well, I don't think I ever really believed in..." Ellen continued before Joanne could finish. No hell, but neither is there a heaven. If you have any comments, good or bad, please send them to our email address at onemomentafter@gmail.com. And you can reach the webpage at cosmofur.hop2.org. Thank you. Until next time. Goodbye.